Okay, go ahead, Mark, do sound speed first.
All right, everyone's ready?
Ready?
Cued. Stand by. Sound speed.
Okay, and Mark, you're gonna need to go in.
Right in front of
Picture
her
way
face.
in front.
In front of her face.
There you go.
After Eden docuseries, Lindsey, take one.
Okay, we're clear and safe, and everyone's settled. Sir?
Okay. Stand by. Do you mind telling us your name, last name, and the organization that you're with and what you guys do?
So my name is Lindsey Speed with Traffic911, and what we do is we focus on freeing youth from sex trafficking through prevention, identification, and empowerment.
How long have you been with Traffic911 or in the fight of sex trafficking?
Yeah, so I've been in the fight against sex trafficking since 2010, so I'm headed into my 9th year of doing this work, and I still love it.
How did you become aware of it? How did you get involved? What was that process?
Yeah, so back in 2010, really through some groups at my church, I was helping raise awareness for the issue overseas and really didn't know much about the issue here locally. And really, through a friend of a friend wanting me to meet up with this person that was helping begin this organization, which was Traffic911, and talking about opening a safe home, they were looking at the time for someone sort of on this committee board who is a creative and to kind of help create this safe home from a creative perspective as well. And so a friend of mine thought of me. And so that was sort of just how I got introduced into this. And I remember sitting down at a Starbucks coffee shop in the mall with this woman who then became my mentor, and she just began to share with me about the issue of trafficking here locally. And I remember at that point, just really not knowing, just totally unaware. And I remember calling my mom when I got home that night, and I was like, I cannot unknow what I just learned. Like, I wish I could go back before I knew about this, because now that I know, it's like something is required, action is required. And so that's when I really started getting involved back then in 2010.
Lindsey, just having known you, and this is not on camera, but having known you for a long time, it's really, really refreshing to see you still having a vibrant spirit like this 9 years in, right? I mean, it is, because I'm going to jump way ahead in the question here, but maybe go a little deeper. What is the burnout rate for the care providers? What is that life like? Because it's relentless, right?
Yeah. Burnout is a real thing in this field because you're dealing with the underbelly of society, and day in and day out. And I always used to say, and I still sometimes think about this, I would almost rather be full-time overseas in the midst of something 24/7 and not have to come in and out, versus here, in the US, you're the service provider, and you have to be in the trenches and facing the underbelly of society and all these stories and these heartache and this trauma, and then try to live a normal life, on your off days or something like that. And so I think that the dichotomy of that is a big struggle in this field of knowing, how do you make sense of the fact that I have a car, I have a good life, I have a good family, yet every single day I am, just bombarded with the depth of depravity of, society and the trauma of the individuals that we work with. And so I think with that, a lot of people, they can't do it long term. It just doesn't make sense. Your life is too divided. And I think what we've really tried to do, and what I've tried to do, is just a constant resetting of values, of why are we in this, of self-care, of all these things, of a support system that says, I'm here, I'm for you, and if we don't have all those things around, it's not long. There's no way it's sustainable.
The realization for you, if you can talk just a little bit about it, Lindsey, that it is domestic, that awakening, for me it was thrusted into it because my sister was trafficked, but for you, just personally, maybe organizationally, it's local. And 911 is hyper local as well. It's in the county even, and in Dallas, and Fort Worth, Denton. Just talk to me a little bit about that progression for you, from, listen, it's not just a broad, which is the general conception, but it's
Yeah.
local. And then 911's work locally, what you do in the community.
Yeah. So, for me, learning about that it was local, I mean, it took a while. It's like this phased learning of as you get to know more about the realities of what it looks like here. I feel like you're constantly being, you're constantly being bombarded with the truth that it's not what you think it is. And it's not the cover narrative story of what people think of, maybe these girls in dog kennels or, chained up or things like that. Because every single time as the years went through that I would be able to work with these girls or boys, none of their stories looked like the narrative that so often is told in trafficking. And so with that, it was really confronted with this reality that the stories that we're seeing here locally, they're so real and they're just constant. I mean, we're getting recoveries, every day, every few days. The police are calling us for a recovery that we can respond to. And the story has never looked exactly like a lot of the narrative that's being told about really just the force and the, the choices that victims either make or not make. And so here locally, it's just trying to understand what got them into this place. Like if we were thinking about victims, and one of my things I like to say, or that I'm sure I heard from somewhere, is just that trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability. And if we look at it like that, there's vulnerability all around. And so whether we're talking about Africa or Dallas, people here have vulnerabilities. I have vulnerabilities. You have vulnerabilities. And so when we started to look at what are the vulnerabilities of these girls and victims that we come across, and how does that look? Like fatherlessness, like poverty, like, education system failing, just different things like that, like sexual abuse in their history. All of those precursors are what brings these girls and boys into what we're seeing them being victimized. And so it's not necessarily this whole snatch reality. And so it's taken a while to kind of be okay with understanding that the story looks different than a lot of times what's perceived. And with Traffic911, I think that probably some of the biggest realities that we've had to face is just what it looks like to walk through life with these kids after the fact, and how so many of them do go back and forth. And that's not not any kind of blame on them, but just because just like domestic violence victims, there's a series of going back and forth until they're really at a place where they can stay out. But with these victims, what we've seen locally is such the need for this walking alongside them in life, no matter where they are. And it can look a lot different depending on which child or victim that we're working with. And so we just meet them where they are. The safe home doesn't necessarily solve everything for every one of these victims. Very few of our victims have really succeeded long-term in a long-term safe home kind of therapeutic model. And so it's kind of meeting them where they are and like, how can we best walk alongside you in life, even if that looks like some re-traumatization along the path. And that's what we've seen kind of here locally being a big need.
Lindsey, the nature of the crime, according to me, and I want your own opinion, very difficult crime to fight because there's misconception, and it is something that's happening in broad daylight. It's something you can, according to me, bleed into society very easily because it is emotional manipulation. And a kid could go to school, be in class, and work that afternoon. And somehow create barriers. I mean, talk to me just about this crime and the difficulties of identifying it, fighting it, versus something like drug trafficking or gun smuggling, something where we have dogs can sniff cocaine.
Yeah.
Dog can't walk past a child and go, this child is under duress. To your opinion of why is this such a difficult crime to fight, and is it because it's out in the open?
I think the difficulty about it's sort of this idea of hidden in plain sight. it's hidden in plain sight in our communities. And I really feel like so much of it is because of the pornified culture of our culture, and how easy it is to just assume what you see. You know, a lot of people are like, you're telling me that this is happening with these numbers of victims, you know, let's just say here in Texas, and why don't we see it? And I'm like, oh, you see it. Oh, you see it. But you don't necessarily know that you see it, because these days you can't tell a difference between, let's say, a 15-year-old who'd maybe just be dressing a little promiscuously and a trafficking victim. They probably look the same. And with everything that's happening with the exploitative nature of really the objectification of women and their bodies. I mean, this is what this is. You know, call it prostitution, which we don't like to, call it whatever you want, but all of that is feeding into the numbing of our society, where it's certainly happening, but no one necessarily sees it or wants to identify it as such, because again, the narrative of what trafficking may look like seems a lot more extreme than when it really looks like if you're in Walmart or if you're out on the track, you know, in Dallas, seeing what this looks like. It's different. And so if we're looking for something that's not there, we're not going to find it.
Yeah, for sure. Can you dive into some Traffic 911 questions just for a minute? The core work that 911 does on a daily basis, the services it renders, this is really a question to really highlight just what you do, and later on we're going to get into the challenges 911 face, and then we're going to get into how people can help.
Cool.
So for now, just more, what is the core mission of 911? You gave us an overview, but it is these kind of services in this community, et cetera, et cetera.
Cool. Yeah, so Traffic 911, we have this big, audacious vision to see a world free of relational brokenness. And I think, you know, when we think about 30,000-foot view of, yes, there's trafficking and exploitation, but what about even bigger than that? What about deeper than that? Where does it go from there? And we realize that so much of it is around relational brokenness, whether that's on the perpetrator side, the victim side, whatever. And so through that, our mission to free youth from sex trafficking, we thought, okay, prevention was really our first foreground into this 10 years ago, thinking, man, wouldn't you rather prevent someone from being a victim of this crime in the first place, or prevent this crime from happening, versus on the restorative side that is so costly and so expensive and so many years in the making. And so with our prevention piece of what Traffic 911 does, we focus on youth, really, really reaching the youth and helping them understand how this is happening and how they could potentially keep from becoming a victim. And the average age, I'm sure a lot of people have heard this before, the average age of entry into sex trafficking here in the United States is anywhere between 12 and 16. There's a lot of different stats out there. And so we thought, who better to reach with a prevention message than going right to that age demographic and then triaging, because it's like, well, who do you reach first? There's 12 to 16-year-olds everywhere. And so really our prevention approach is triaging the most vulnerable youth first. And so that's when we're going into juvenile detention centers. We're reaching around 7,000 youth every year with our prevention programming in these high-risk areas, because we've got to triage the situation and reach those who are most at risk first. And so we're talking juvenile detention kids, CPS system kids, kids who are in shelters, homeless kids, LGBTQ, reaching those populations first with the message. And then, of course, you know, general audience. And that leads us into identification, where there's still there's some great identification happening across, let's just say, the state of Texas, but also talking about how many more professionals really need to be trained to look for this, because again, that could help prevention, but also intervene in a potential victim. And so that's where our training of first responders is so important to us. And this is something that it's a big passion of mine, because we've been in this field now for 10 years and we've walked alongside hundreds of survivors day after day. And so while I may not have a background in the medical field, I can definitely come in and say, this is a perspective that you're going to see presented in a medical setting. And it comes a little bit different coming from someone like me who's worked directly with victims versus maybe just a nurse who's been, seeing a victim here or there in their field. And so the training of first responders is really important. And then the last phase of what we do is our empowerment work. And so that's our direct victim services work with youth. It takes up the biggest piece of the pie of what we do budget wise, because it's the most costly. And it needs the most human capital investment, because you're working with human lives day in and day out who have been traumatized on every level. And our goal with our Voice and Choice program, which I really got to develop a couple years ago as some opportunities came in our state to say, how can we address this issue from a bigger perspective, really all collaborating together, not just one agency or one law enforcement or one DA's office, but how can we all come together and address this issue? And through that, they developed this idea of advocates who can walk along, and it's actually in our state mandate now, legislative laws, to have victims who have been identified as trafficking victims, child sex trafficking victims, connected with this advocate case manager as soon as possible in the identification process to walk with them along a journey up until 24, 25 or beyond. And so we got the opportunity to really create a program that we've been doing for years. We've been walking alongside. I mean, it's relational. It's all about developing relationships with these survivors and helping them wherever they're at in their journey. But really what happened a few years ago is we got to programatize is probably the wrong word, but we got to put a little bit more teeth around this idea of what does it look like to relationally invest in survivors long term. And it's not tied to any, residential placement. It's not tied to any one service. We just go wherever they are and we stay with them. Maybe she's in Montana. We're going to go visit her in Montana. We're going to just go where they are. And so we got to put together that program, and it's now called Voice and Choice Program. And the whole idea is, how can we help empower them to have their voice and to have their choice in all of this situation? Because when we're working with children, the problem is so many systems will come in and try to fix things because they're children. And so how can we empower them with a voice throughout that process? Because really, if we all think we have the cookie cutter model to healing, we're all wrong, because every person is unique and different and requires a different response. And so with our Voice and Choice program, we've got those advocates who respond in crisis. Law enforcement calls, recovers a victim. We get to respond within 60 minutes and be down there at the police station with a bag and just a loving face to say, hey, I'm here for you. I'm not CPS. I'm not law enforcement. I'm just going to be here with you on this journey until you fire me, until you don't want me anymore. And seeing that kind of trajectory long term now has just been the most rewarding and the most hard thing ever to do, but it's been pretty incredible. And so, yeah, it's the Traffic911 story.
Let's see, a couple of rapid fire questions. The process of getting information on a potential victim, sending that process in the state of Texas to the authorities, be it Homeland Security, FBI, local PD, that response time, the proactiveness in the state of Texas, and I want to draw a delineation between Texas and some other states with some other interviewees, because I do feel Texas is on the move, and some states are not.
Yeah.
So just because other states will see this,
Cool. Yeah.
other organizations in San Francisco will see this.
Yeah.
And this is how, it's just a learn share between organizations.
And I didn't know how much you wanted me to talk about,
No,
like
yeah.
geography. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, you can. I'm going to ask you later what you think of what's happening in the rest of the country.
Cool.
Okay. So just for now, the process and kind of the support you're seeing in Texas, and why? Why is there support? Because I'm on the advisory board, and I've been on the board, so I know what's happening, and it's different. Very different. So just your perspective on what that collaboration looks like with authorities, that there actually is response, and why? Why is there response in Texas?
Yeah, that's good. So a number of years ago, I think what really helped put a lot of attention on this in our state in Texas is that there was legislation that passed that really made this a priority. And so in Texas, a number of years ago, there was legislation that passed that said your governor's office will have a child sex trafficking team, and you will figure out how to make this more coordinated response and make this more priority for our systems in Texas. And so a lot of it started from there as far as buy-in, because I think that's what we need. We need buy-in from every level of every system to put pressure, not necessarily to put pressure, but to put some prioritization on a victimization and a crime that is definitely a sexy crime from the prosecution standpoint, but what is happening to the victims, especially, they might just be pulled in for a testimony, but then no one's, really following through with it. So a lot of the legislation not only was on the prosecution and even prevention side, but the restorative side as well. And what we've seen is just this incredible network of support statewide from systems, because there's been legislation. And I will say the biggest piece of that has been not only legislation, but funding attached to legislation, because so many systems they're just squashed for time, squashed for resources, squashed for human capital. So you can say all you want, like, make this a priority, but if they don't have the funding to make it a priority, then it's not going to be a priority. And I believe what our state did was they attached the legislation with the funding, not only for the Department of Family and Protective Services, but for service providers, for safe homes, for all of the different DA's offices, for so many. They have provided funding across the board in our state. And so with that now, we've seen kind of basically these county responses, which I think has been really neat. I mean, Texas is a huge state. And so how are you supposed to kind of come in and say, this is the way it's supposed to work across this huge state? And what the state has said is, every county, once you figure out how this looks in your county, find the stakeholders that work and make a process, make policies and procedures, come together, sign memorandums of understanding and say, this is what my agency is willing to do. And so what happened is, it's not like they just said, hey, go do this, and they left us. Basically, the governor's office has been invested in all of these meetings for the last number of years to say, we're going to walk alongside you guys and figure out, how does this look like in Dallas County? And let you guys vote on what you say as constituents of your county that these victims and this process needs. And so with that, we've just seen incredible commitment from all the way from law enforcement to, all the different parties involved, including service providers and NGOs, to say, we're all going to sit at the table, and this is going to get ugly before it gets great. And we're just in for it. We're in for the fact that working together is harder than working in silos, because you could just do your own thing when you're silo, but it's not for the better good. It's not for the greater good, but it can be harder working together, and that's what we're seeing here in the state of Texas. It's like, some dysfunctional families sometimes when you're working with law enforcement and you're calling this detective and you're saying, no, we don't believe this is the best thing for this victim, and then all of a sudden they get to know your heart because you're together all the time, and they're like, I think you may be right. I think that girl maybe shouldn't be taken to jail tonight. I think maybe she should go to a shelter. And so all of that has really come through this top-down approach, which is really crazy to me, but this top-down approach of buy-in from the state level, saying, we want to empower you guys, fund you guys, support you guys, county by county, to figure out how you can collaboratively come together and address this response from all levels.
Your opinion, and if you have one, and if you don't, that's fine, is that the same nationwide in other states and counties?
Oh gosh, I don't think so. From what I hear, really what Texas is doing is probably the first state that's really implementing this statewide. I know that there's a lot of counties, like we've learned a lot from LA County. They're doing incredible work, and some other counties across the nation. But from a statewide perspective, we are really here, and we get calls. The reason I know a little bit is because we'll get calls from other states saying, hey, could you guys come out and teach us how is this working in Dallas or in Texas, and how are you guys getting buy-in from all these different stakeholders that you have to have? I mean, to do work in this arena, you've got to have buy-in from stakeholders in the system. And I think that's where other states, and for us for so long, had struggled, because, you just got these, again, silos. And so I think what Texas is doing is really forerunning a statewide approach.
And what are one of the toughest challenges Traffic 911 is facing currently today?
Oh, goodness. Let me think. How honest do you want me to be? Like from a programmatic standpoint or an organizational standpoint? Okay, I'll just go both then. Let me think. As an organization, some of our biggest challenges right now are now that there is this system-wide approach and we have been able to be invited at so many tables, it's almost like there's too much work and not enough time or resources or staff. And so, I mean, for just as a real example, we have a number of full-time advocates that respond in crisis to victims. And when we initially wrote this program and were requesting some funding a number of years ago, you have to put in how many victims you think you'll serve with these staff and all these things. And we had this number, I think one year it was like, we'll serve 60 victims. And I think that first year we had like 180 or something. I mean, it was just been such a surprising, overwhelming response of, and it's just, I think it's from all systems, really identifying these kids more, recognizing them more, referring them to our services. And through that, it's created this need where it's like, whoa, how do we respond to this in a way that's quality over quantity? Because we can touch a lot of victims and help them on a small level, but we want to go deep. We want to go really 2 levels under with them and walk with them through life. And that takes time and it takes staff. And so we're at this really interesting kind of growth spurt juncture where we're really trying to figure out how do we structurally and organizationally, operationally make sense for this growth? And we want it, but we also want to be wise about growth and what that means and how do we steward resources well and figure out how much staff can take on, how much volunteers can take on. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's probably some of our biggest struggles right now organizationally. If you want me to talk about kind of programmatically with victims, I can do that as well.
We will.
Okay.
I want to ask you this. The laws that exist in the state of Texas is good. Are they being enforced? And I'm talking about, are they being enforced unilaterally across all the stakeholders? The laws for protecting the victim, the pimp, the bottom girl, the John, particularly the buyer. Why in a state of Texas that has arguably some of the best laws, are we still not quite seeing a huge move, definitely not nationwide, towards taking on some members of the buying community that may be high profile?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a soapbox that so many of us can get on is, if there wasn't demand, there wouldn't be supply. So at the end of the day, we're talking about what does demand look like and how do we reduce it and how do we eliminate it, really? And when it comes to that, I think that systems and organizations, we can all get really focused on the victim piece, the perpetrator piece as far as the trafficker goes, and just run ourselves ragged in response to those and never addressing necessarily the demand side of the equation. And I think what's happening is there are a lot of really good laws here in Texas, but it requires so much funding and training to implement and to really bring buy-in to those laws across the state. And so, as an example, I mean, if the priority for a certain police department or a law enforcement agency is arrest in this, area or something, then, I mean, if there's not buy-in from the top down on why we should go after Johns instead of rescuing victims, then they're just not going to prioritize their resources towards that. So there can be laws all day, but if we're going after the trafficker all the time instead of the John, then again, I think we're spinning our wheels. It's good, but it's not the best if we're talking about, how do we eradicate this issue? And so I think in the nitty gritty, it's about providing more funding to law enforcement to be able to have more staff to go after Johns, number one, but then they need to be trained because there's just so many smaller jurisdictions that, I mean, they have no idea, like really that one, those laws exist, that they could go after these criminals in this way, how to go after them. And that's where, state and federal law enforcement agencies help so much. And this is just because like the small law enforcement jurisdiction, they've never taken down, done a John sting, or they call it a reverse sting, where they're going after the Johns. They don't have the manpower to put together an operation like that. And so again, we can have the laws, but we need to go a few levels deeper in that. And I think, some of the high profile pieces of buyers and who they are. And let's be honest, buyers for the most part, obviously money is just one thing of many that can be exchanged, but money is a big one that's exchanged for sex. And you've got to have money to be in this business and in the buyer's standpoint. And so who has money? The more money they have, the more disposable income they have, potentially to spend on something like this. And so those are people in power. And those are some of the very people who, if we're saying there needs to be buy-in from, leadership, department levels, all these things, well, then how can the very people who are potentially a part of this problem or driving demand, they're not going to buy in to an approach that says we need to shut this down. So I know there's good and bad apples in every group. So it's definitely not, calling one out necessarily, but we know it's prolific all around. And so that's definitely a big challenge.
Lindsey, just some statistics for you. What are some of the statistics, numbers, according to your organization, things you feel comfortable with in the state of Texas? What are we looking at, children trafficked yearly? What is the number that you feel comfortable with? And then also, give us some detail on what do these Johns typically pay for a visit? Typically, what's the average time a girl spends in this crime? Some of those, just pop them off, some highlights for me on some of the stats you feel comfortable with from your organization. I'm not talking about Polaris and anybody else.
Yeah.
You got
it. Yeah. So statistics and numbers, honestly, is just it's a point of contention with so many of us in the anti-trafficking field, because this is such a hidden crime. So how do you put numbers on and quantify something that is so hidden? And so what I always say is when we're doing trainings or when people are spouting out statistics, and I'm like, take statistics with a grain of salt, because they are just that. And we know less than we don't know, to me, in this field. And so no one's an expert in this yet. We're all just trying to go about it and learn more as we go. And so with that, it can be really hard to quantify a problem that is so hidden. We hear all these numbers being thrown out, and a lot of them are, based on different reports kind of coming together, or maybe calls that have been made into a hotline or something like that. Within Traffic911, just for example, on who we serve, we serve around 150 victims a year in our intensive voice and choice program. But obviously that's a drop in the bucket in what we know is out there. We know that I feel really comfortable with. A statistic that's been around the Dallas area for a while is that they believe that there's 400 girls underage on the street at any given night being trafficked. And that's a number I feel really comfortable with, because we are seeing it. There's just recovery after recovery. And the stories we hear from the girls and boys, they're out there in a lot bigger numbers probably than we know. But the issue is just how do you quantify that? And so, that's an issue. What was the other thing you said? Johns. On the demand side, as far as the girls call them tricks or dates, and what they're having to do day in and day out. And I guess one of the things I hear a lot, and I see a lot in some of our different cases, is the vast extremities based on social spectrum and maybe the perpetrator or the trafficker that particular, let's just say, girl had. And so I've had girls who they were working on a little bit higher end area or clientele, if you will, and they were, having clients for $500 a pop, or, you know, things like that, versus some of the girls more in the poverty stricken areas, because demand is demand. Whatever socioeconomic area you're in, there's still demand for sex. So that doesn't necessarily, that goes beyond, you know, economics. And so in the more of the poverty stricken areas with some of the girls that we've worked with there, I mean, it's more like $20, you know, $20 per John, or even less. And then when you get into even more of just kind of that poverty, and underprivileged areas where it's in exchange for their drug habit, because maybe they were a drug baby, parents were on drugs, now girls on drugs, and the way she gets her drugs is by having sex in exchange for drugs. And so sometimes it's not even a monetary amount like that. And so we see it span the spectrum here, especially in a bigger city, that I've seen, go from one extreme to the other.
Strange question for you. I don't know if you've ever been asked this before, but are these pimps paying taxes?
Are the pimps paying taxes? I do not believe so. Although I will say we've seen a lot of cases where they have a business that's the, you know, kind of the shell business or a cover business, that maybe there is a little bit of taxes that's paid from, but their underlying, their trafficking victim, their exploitation business, definitely not. We're talking about tax-free money in their hands.
Are these victims financially stacking up? Are they making quite a bit of money from this?
Victims are definitely not making money from this. You know, it's interesting, actually. We talk a lot about this with some of the service providers that work with the girls and us, because there is this fascination with money with these girls. And it's fascinating to me because they aren't getting it. They're not getting the money, but they have the money go through their hands. And I mean, there's these tattoos that some of the girls I've seen have that says money over everything. You see MOE a lot, money over everything. They're so fascinated with money. Obviously, because that's what their perpetrator is feeding this narrative that says, this is what you're doing. This is how we as a family are making this income for us, even though as soon as she makes that income, it's going straight to someone else. Yet still, there is such an interesting dynamic there with the love of money that the girls fall in love with, even though they don't get to keep it, and they certainly don't, you know, they're not the holders of it. But what's been pushed into their mind is, well done, baby girl. You know, like, you made this for us. You're amazing, you know? And so, man, you feel so much value. Like, I did make that. That's amazing. And so there's just this thing. And so then when you take them out of that lifestyle and say, hey, I got a job for you at Taco Bell, you know, making whatever. And it's like some of these girls are making $1,000 a day. And so we're asking them to leave a life of seemingly luxury and enter a life of poverty to be out of what we would consider slavery. And it's a hard dynamic to swallow. And it's one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. I'm like, well, why did they go back? Or why don't they just stay out of this life? It's like, they've seen a lot of money pass through their hands, and someone is really praising them for that. And so when someone from maybe a rough background has never had any praise or value being spoken into their life, and all of a sudden someone's speaking all of this value into their life around what they've earned, that's something all of us long for. And so it can be a hard thing.
Lindsey, talk to me a little bit, if you go deep just on forced fraud, coercion. Just what are the mind games that a girl online who goes to a normal school, because I also want to start painting who is the victim. It's not always the runaway.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always someone chained up.
Mm-hmm.
It's trapped in their own environment sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of these methods
Mm-hmm.
the profilers and pimps use, particularly online?
Online, okay. So when we talk about trafficking as the exploitation of vulnerability, when you really think about how broad vulnerability can be, I think that's when we start to realize how really anyone can become a victim. We know that there are people who have more vulnerabilities, which maybe ups their level of potential to be recruited or lured into this life. But we also know that every young teenage girl has vulnerabilities. And especially when you bring in the internet and social media and the fact that people can be whoever they want behind a screen. And then all of a sudden you have these young teenage girls who are creating these personas, if you will, and these profiles that are putting so much out there, and they're desiring such love and affection and attention, no matter what socioeconomic level they're in. That's especially young girls, unfortunately. And then you've got perpetrators who want to take advantage of that. And so, and social media and just the internet in general has created every mode possible to facilitate that interaction. I mean, we've got every social media, platform under the sun that helps a perpetrator, facilitate conversation and communication and relationship with vulnerable people, and with no filters. For the most part, no filters. Every, let's just say, 16-year-old girl can pop on and create who they want to be, talk to who they want, and we've got people wanting to take advantage of that. And if you put your mind in the mindset of a recruiter or a perpetrator, a trafficker, however you want to call them, what better place to, make a connection and start to build trust in someone than the internet, where they can hide behind this facade and be whoever they want. Which honestly, with our cases, there's not a whole lot of this catfishing. I haven't seen as many of those cases where, it's this old dirty guy who's pretending to be this great looking guy. When we're educating young people, we're like, no, just because they look good doesn't mean that their intentions are well. That they have good intentions. And so just because a guy or a girl, because we've had girls and guy recruiters online, recruiting young girls or boys, just because they look a certain way and maybe you FaceTime them or you video chatted them, so all is well because you have seen them and you've heard these teachings of stranger danger and these catfish and these dirty men behind the computer screen. So we've got them kind of thinking, oh, as long as it's not that, we're safe. And so we've got these kids wanting to go meet up with these people who they've FaceTimed or video chatted or Snapchatted with because they look safe, they look normal, and they're good looking. And so we do see those cases a lot. And with the internet, and I think with parents' inability to keep up with all of that, it can be really, really complex because parents, don't know what they don't know. And so that's where we've seen a lot of cases that didn't necessarily fit a high risk model. But we have a girl who is communicating with a guy online and they end up meeting up for a date, but there wasn't any vulnerability other than love, than affection, than attention. But because they met online and things seemed right, they meet up and, the rest is history. And so it's just so much easier because of the internet. And I would say, if I can, both on the recruitment side with the victims, but also with the demand side, because now Johns can go right online and choose who they would like to have a date with versus maybe, in prior years where they could go out and be on the track and have to pick up a girl. Now they can go online and be totally anonymous and meet up with her wherever USA. And so again, the internet has created a filter for that as well. That's another barrier for the continuation of this and the growth of this.
Lindsey, tough question, but now we're delving into First Amendment right, freedom of speech, internet, censorship, Zuckerberg in front of Congress, this whole issue. Where do we draw the line with minors? I mean, at some point that's going to lead into my next question, pornography. What is your opinion about porn? Does porn feed the demand? Online porn with teens? I know it's loaded, so let's start just with First Amendment. How do we now attack this thing you just talked about, online activity and you're bouncing against this First Amendment right.
Yeah, the First Amendment definitely is a barrier, is a challenge, and we can understand why people are saying certain things around the First Amendment. But I think that's when it really has to become a numerics game. Let's talk about, and I think that's probably what Backpage did, and a lot of that as Backpage was shut down, and some of these different things around that issue. It's a matter of, look, you can be First Amendment right all day, but let's talk about the number of children who have been exploited by the facilitation of your website or your social media app. That stands on its own, and you can't debate that with First Amendment. Anyone who loves First Amendment, that's fine, but you also probably, hopefully, love children and hope that they're not being exploited or taken advantage of. So you can't defend the fact when you talk about the numbers and you just say this many cases and look at the prosecutions across the United States and the world and say this many cases of children have been exploited through and that have been facilitated, whether meaningly or unintentionally, through your website or through your social media app. And so who can argue with that?
Pornography.
Yeah.
Just how does that play into creating demand? Does it, according to you?
I 1000% believe that pornography is fueling the demand for trafficking. And in all of the years that I've been involved with this and research and hearing stories and seeing interviews with Johns, I think that what we see is this progression of a desire. And so, and we can, I think this is so relatable because we all can relate to this on some level in our lives of just things that are unhealthy that progress if they're not taken advantage, or if they're not taken into, consideration and dealt with, then there's a progression of an unhealthy thing. And so to me, it comes down to this unhealthy thing of pornography, which so often we see cases and research is out on it of Johns who they've done, research on, done interviews with to see where did it start? Where did it start with you that you ended up at this place where you probably never would have thought you would have been? And by and large, what we're seeing is that it is an issue of pornography, one of many, but the issue of pornography is at the central point of so much of this, where there was a desire that was fulfilled in that, but then wasn't fulfilled after a while. So then we lead to, okay, well, then they're actually going to step out of their house and go to, let's say, a sexually oriented business, let's say one of the video stores or something like that. So they're putting themselves in a public place, let's just say, so it's a little bit more risky, but all of a sudden that happens for all, and that's not satisfying. So now we're going to the next level. So then maybe they're, going to a strip club. So they're looking, but they're not engaging. But again, after a while, that doesn't satisfy. So then it leads us to the purchase of sex. It makes sense of the progression of, sexual human need, that if it's not really, kept at bay in a healthy way, then this is the progression that takes place.
What would the effect of decriminalizing prostitution have on child sex trafficking?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. So many different views on it, and I don't feel like I'm as well stated in this yet as I can. It's in my mind, but I don't know if I can get it out. But so there's the decriminalization of prostitution, which I'm all for in essence, because they are not they are not criminals. So we know that they are not criminals. Most of us are getting to the point to agree with that, whether a child or an adult, but especially an adult, because that's where the biggest issue here in the United States is around criminalizing adult sex trafficking victims as with a prostitution charge or other. So we can get our mind around that, but, oh man, I lost my train of thought. Hold
What
on.
does that do to the pimp? Does that give him liberty?
Decriminalization of prostitution. So are you thinking more on the side of criminalizing prostitution on the perp side of the trafficker, or truly on the prostitute?
Just how does it affect the industry?
Yeah.
Industry protects the individual,
Right.
gives her rights,
Right.
and rights. But how does it affect the industry?
Yeah.
Is that going to open an ocean to a pimp going, okay, there's a fear that if you talk to anybody, you're going to be prosecuted as a criminal. That fear now is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And now, does that positively affect the world of the trafficker? Does it negatively affect the world of the trafficker?
Right.
Would it make him more bold because now a law is removed and he can now, or does it harm him?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's good in the sense of a victim being treated as a victim. So that's where we're getting to is some of the safe harbor laws across the United States are, let's decriminalize the victim here. But it can also create some challenges of, well, what happens when there's no law that says anything about this. And so then law enforcement stop intervening in a lot of situations where they may actually be recovering girls who would love a chance to get out of this life. But then now it's all just sort of died down. And so potentially on the trafficker side, it could look like, free reign now, because we're just going to go do this because there's not going to be any police going after us because prostitution, is now decriminalized. And so there's pluses and minuses in both. I don't think it in and of itself solves the issue. I think it's definitely one facet of the issue that needs to be addressed and is better, across the United States more and more so. Although not every state in the United States is even at the point yet where there's some states in the United States that are still arresting children and charging them with prostitution. That is still a thing. So we have a long way to go in some of that. But I think there's a lot more dynamics at play than just that one decriminalization will solve everything,
Lindsey, the children that you're working with, we're going to focus on children for a second here. There is some crazy notion that some of them wanted that it's a choice at 12, at 15, at 17, the trauma involved. You said earlier it's the most costly and the most time-consuming to rehabilitate and empower, right? Why? What is the emotional state of a victim when they are rescued?
Mm-hmm. So let's just say these girls, we know it's girls and boys. Let's just say for this case, when these girls are recovered, our experience is they present usually as someone from the outside would say, ungrateful or sometimes even totally fighting it. That's why we're really careful with the use of the word rescue, because in all of our cases, most girls would not see it until much further down the road that they were actually rescued out of this. They're recovered. So we try to use that word because it's hard because this is the life that they've known for a while. And some of them in varying levels and lengths of time. But this life of feeling like, we're talking about children, that they're not with their parents. They're kind of doing what they want, even though it's got its negatives. It's also got its positives because they feel, and what's been being communicated to them so intentionally by the perpetrator, the pimp, the trafficker is, they're empowered. They're empowered to do this. This is what you're good at, all these things. And we're making money to support this family that we've created, all these things. And so there's manipulation that's happened on such a deep level of who they are that really keeps them from feeling like they want to get out of it. And I think with the girls that we've seen, a lot of it is the fear of the unknown. At least this is what I know. And that's more comfortable than what I don't know. And so for children, a lot of the cases that we see, let's say that a girl gets recovered out of this life, and let's say she's been in this life for 6 months, and really rough home life, which a lot of our girls have had, and let's just say that CPS is going to take custody of her. And so now there's a lot of unknown in that. Most kids do not have a good view of the child welfare system. And so I would rather go back to, I'm just saying what the girls are thinking is, I'd rather go back to what I know than what I don't know, which is they're going to put me up in some place that I don't want to be at with people I don't want to be with and make me do all these things I don't want to do. And so, and kind of, tell me what I have to do versus over here where there's been all of this psychological manipulation that has made me think I actually do want to do this stuff. And so the way that looks in our society is that they are choosing this. That's what it looks like because that's how they present. And so, like with the money thing, I think that one of the conversations we have with a lot of our girls is just kind of, it's called motivational interviewing. It's this idea that you're reflective listening. You're just kind of trying to talk to them in a way that's very trauma informed, very victim centered, and helping them kind of get to the place themselves where they're saying, well, this is what it was actually really like to be in the life. These are the really hard things. These were the Johns that held me at gunpoint. These were the times I got beat, down to the ground by my pimp. Like, talking to them and helping in an understanding way is like, help me understand what was it like on the day to day. And so that helps remind them what it really was like, because there's this manipulation that the psychological manipulation kind of overpowers all of that and says, I want to do this, I want to do this. But let's actually get down in the nitty-gritty and talk about what was it like in the life? What was the day-to-day like? And so when you really get to that place with these girls and women and children and boys, all of them end up getting to a place where like, no, that's not what I want to do. That was what I felt like I had to do, or that was the resort that I feel like I was at. But still the problem is though, in our culture though, that's not an easily explainable thing. So it's much easier just to explain they're choosing to do this. They're bad kids. They like sex. I've heard so many like caseworkers or law enforcement agencies say, well, they just like to have sex. This is just what they like to do. And so I'm like, no, we're going to need to dig a little deeper. It's much deeper than that.
Lindsey, maybe something we didn't cover as the last question. What are some of the things about this crime that you would like to portray to people that maybe we didn't cover? If you feel we covered it, that's fine.
About the crime in general?
Or just the
Or
fact,
just,
or
yeah.
911. Anything that's important to you in the world of sex trafficking that
Okay.
you feel I may have missed from your perspective that I want to give you a chance to cover?
I can't remember if I said it or not, but I think because we're so invested in the rehabilitative piece especially, because we're so invested in that, I'm so passionate about people understanding that there's not a cookie cutter model to healing. And so many people, when they hear about this issue, and this is what we did 10 years ago, we're like, we're opening a safe home. We're opening a safe home. This is the solution. And I am so for safe homes. I really, really am. But there are not enough beds in America to hold all of these kids. We need way more creative solutions than just a safe home or rehabilitative model is going to solve all these issues. And I think that's where we kind of got to step outside the box and be a lot more creative on how we walk alongside survivors and really hear from them on what would they have wanted. Let's say, talk to a 25-year-old survivor who's out of the life now and say, like, what would you have wanted at 16? And really get to a place where we have a lot more options and rehabilitative models and systems than just kind of this cookie cutter, this is the solution. And I think with that, in the anti-trafficking field, we all have to be more humble on our piece of the pie. Because, this is what we're doing, our voice and choice program, our empowerment program, everything we're doing, it's great. But when we're looking for options for survivors to heal from this, I'm like, let's look at all the options, because every survivor is going to heal differently and someone else's model may be better for them. And so I think kind of looking at it from a more human and humble perspective of saying, a lot of people have great ideas in how to address this issue. And let's not shut any of those down. Let's welcome them all, but let's also recognize it's not a one size fits all model in any of this.
And if you don't mind, just again your name, last name, and organization.
Yeah, so it's Lindsey Speed with Traffic911.
Okay.
Wow. Good job, Lindsey.
Super.